Good evening, dear participants. Welcome to webinar of Turkish Atlantic Council. This is our first webinar. We are hoping to proceed with many other seminars and meeting you in different topics. Today we have a special guest, Mr. Ömer Özkızılcık, who has published a report on escape from the Syrian Labyrinth, a specific roadmap for United States to get out from Syria and re-establish better relations with Turkey and the neighboring countries. So, welcome, Mr. Ömer Özkızılcık.
Welcome. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and thanks for this opportunity.
Yeah. You have published a report in Hudson Institute with Michael Doran about a proposal for United States, a Syrian policy for United States. So can you, before getting into the report, can you give us some brief background about the current situation in Syria?
Yes, definitely. Let me that the Syrian conflict, it's a very complex environment in which the international actors are and in position to each other. And in this, there are many maps to ease and illustrate and visualize the territorial control in Syria. Usually, these maps focus on the local actors who control the territories in Syria. So the Assad regime, which is based in Damascus, then the Syrian opposition, which is in Idlib, in northern Aleppo, and in northern Raqqa. And then you have the areas held by the YPG-dominated Syrian Democratic Forces. But I think that these kind of maps are not good to understand and acknowledge the real power dynamics inside Syria. If we do not look on the level of local actors on Syria, but on the level of international actors, areas of influence, then the map is much different, because at the moment, the map on the screen, which has been shared now, illustrates that there's an area of influence of the United States of America. There's an area of influence of Turkey and of Russia and of Iran. These are the four main actors involved in the Syrian conflict on the ground, with boots on the ground and with a real impact. So, for instance, if we would look at the map from the local actors perspective, the area where the American area of influence ends and the Russian area of influence begins would be colored in the same color, most likely yellow, as it would be controlled by the YPG-dominated Syrian Democratic Forces. But on the level of international actors, the area controlled by the YPG, the dominated Syrian Democratic Forces, can be divided into two. The eastern part, in which American soldiers are present, and the western part in which Russian soldiers are present. So therefore, it is, from my perspective, always better to look from the actor level of international states rather than from local states, in order to have a real understanding. And for example, the areas of influence of Turkey, all of these areas are on the local level controlled by the Syrian opposition. However, here we also have a difference, that the area in Idlib, which is the western southern part of the area of influence of Turkey, is mainly dominated by Hayat Tahrir Sham, a Sunni radical jihadist organization, and with an important presence of the legitimate moderate Syrian opposition. And then you have northern Aleppo and northern Raqqa, which is served by this army. To our listeners, Syrian is often as thirds. Syrian Democrats are and get many actors are controlled and dominated PG, which compose of a Kurdish Marxist organization. And the YPG is the Syrian branch of the PKK and designated terrorist organization by the US, by Turkey, NATO, and the European Union. And also the main area of conflict between Turkey and the United States. And what has been described as the Syrian National Army. Most of the people know them as with their former name, the Free Syrian Army, as they were referred to in the media. And then you have the areas in which Russia and Iran have an area of influence. These areas are controlled by the YPA, by the Assad regime, and you have the Iranian Shia militias from different countries, many foreign militias on the ground, as well as Russian military personnel and the Assad regime's Syrian Arab Army units, which are now very different than they were in the pre-war period. So this is in general the situation in Syria. And looking at it from this map perspective, we see that there are 4 different actors. We have area of influence, but in reality, Iran and Russia are working together with each other. And Iran and Russia are both supporting the Assad regime, and they are both, even though they have some disagreements and some difference in tactics and strategy, they know that they are going to, they have to work together, and they have to stand next to each other. Otherwise, they will both lose. However, 2 NATO allies, Turkey and the United States of America, are in contrast not working with each other. On the contrary, their political and military actions on the ground are opposing to each other. And this allows for Russia and Iran to step by step increase their leverage in Syria and the area of influence, as well as their diplomatic and political position in Syria, because the US partners on the ground are half reliable on Russia and half reliable on the United States of America. They need Russia for military protection, and they need the US for military and financial support. And the area of the Syrian Democratic Force is therefore divided into 2, the eastern part held by the United States and the western part by Russia. So to sum up, this is the general outlook in Syria.
Thank you for your brief explanation. And what do you think about the role of Iran? I mean, Turkey is in but Iran, they're working with interests, same goal on countering against the Russian and Iranian influence. So is there any coordination or alliance between Russia and Iran, or are they separated between?
So Iran and Russia are working closely with each other. As we know, Iran was the first foreign country who intervened in Syria in early 2012. And they engaged since then with the Iran and with the Shia militias and have baked the Assad regime on several fronts, and they provide the Assad regime with important manpower. However, in 2015, when the Iranian support wasn't enough to keep the Assad regime in power, and the Assad regime was on the verge of losing the war, Russia intervened and changed the dynamics and the power balance on the ground against the Syrian opposition and in favor of the Assad regime. And since then, Iran and the Russian militaries have been in close coordination in Syria. And we can easily say that the Russian military might, especially in the air and with the air defense system, was very crucial to change the battlefield dynamics. However, on the ground and in the long run, the role of Iran is different than the role of Russia. Russia wants to maintain a military presence, wants to secure its political path, the Assad regime, but Iran is playing the long game. Iran wants to indoctrinate the Syrian community, wants to expand its Shia ideology, and is trying to, with micromanagement, control the entire apparatus of the Assad regime, and so far they have been quite successful. And from time to time, there are some disagreements between these both sides in terms of sharing of resources and strategic and tactical goals. It happens that the Iranians want to launch a military operation, which are not that much supported by the Russians, or vis-a-vis the exact opposite. But in general, they work together. On the political level, both support the Assad regime. On the military level, both support the Assad regime, and both have a clear enemy in Syria. And the clear enemy is the Syrian opposition, backed by Turkey, and the armed force of the US military. So here something is very interesting, that Russia, even though Russia and Iran want the United States of America to get out of Syria, they do not want to eliminate the partner of the Syrian Democratic Force. The contrary perspective, Turkey wants a YPG main dollars, but do not get with US military personnel. And therefore, we see that the Iranian militias and the Russian military units are engaging in direct cooperation with the YPG in Tel Rifat, in Manbij, in Ain al-Arab, which is in the media known as Kobane, and in Ain Isa, Tel Tamil, Amuda, Dilbasiya. We see that in these areas, the Russian military is directly protecting the YPG. And what is here fascinating is that the local partner of the US in Syria is directly working with the Russians, despite the war ongoing in Ukraine. And despite the huge difference in Ukraine, we see that in Syria, the Russians and Iranians can actually support the same local partner of the United States. And here comes the question, why do they do this? Why can they work with the US partner in Syria? And I think the main reason here is, and I think we can speak about this later, that in the end, Iran and Russia believes that if they can establish a working relationship with the US partner in Syria, that they ultimately can kick out the Americans and they bet on the uncoordinated, unplanned withdrawal of the US from Syria, just like the US did in Afghanistan or during the Obama administration in Iraq.
So it seems Russia doesn't care who is in charge in Syria, and an Iranian-influenced government, Shia-dominated government, or a secular government just wants to keep his presence on Mediterranean. So what is the position of United States and the ultimate goal of United States in this conflict?
So when it comes to the ultimate goal, actually the Turkish and American positions are aligned with each other. Both want a political solution according to the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254, which foresees a negotiation process between the Syrian opposition and the Assad regime, a new transitional government, a new constitution for Syria, and free and fair elections all across Syria. But when it comes to the reality on the ground, they differ much. The US, since 2014, have been heavily engaged in the counter-ISIS efforts. And at that time, the Obama administration searched for a local partner in Syria to fight against ISIS. But here, the Obama administration wanted to fight ISIS while also not endangering its deal. Therefore, the Obama administration clear criteria for Syria. This criteria: one, who American partner fights against ISIS can against Iran or the Assad regime from this fighting. And obviously, the Free Syrian Army and the Syrian Sunni Arab opposition against the Assad regime has not accepted that, because they have a huge animosity with Iran and they hate the Iranian regime. They know the sectarian policies of Iran and they have seen the autocracies committed by Iran in Syria with their own eyes, and they do want to fight Iran up until the day their country is freed from Iranian military presence. So therefore, they did not accept this criteria imposed by the Obama administration, but there was one actor, and this was the YPG, the Syrian branch of the PKK terror group, which accepted to not fight against Iran. Actually, they have not, up until that date, fought against Iran or the Assad regime, as they had a pragmatic relationship with each other. But this policy, ultimately, with the partial withdrawal in 2019 under the Trump administration, has cornered the US onto the small territory you can see on the map. In the south is the province of Deir ez-Zor, in the north, the governorate of the province of Hasaka. And you have a relatively, the biggest oil resource in Syria is in these areas, in the areas of influence of the US. But in relation to the international oil reserves, the oil reserves in Syria aren't that important. I have to underline that. And if the current trajectory goes on, we see that the Turkish armed force is pushing against the YPG. We see that the Iranians and the Russians are playing the long game against the US. We see that the Assad regime is normalizing relations with the Arab states in the Middle East step by step. And ultimately, this can lead only in three different alternative ends. The first is someday the US has to accept this reality, and the US has to withdraw from Syria uncoordinated, and all of the areas currently in the US zone of influence, and with that also all of Syria, will get under the Russian and Iranian zone of influence. The second step is the US can drag its feet and try to remain as long as possible in Syria and maintain stubborn and try not to give any inch. But ultimately, this will only postpone the inevitable. The end result will be the same again. So, and therefore, seeing this, that the current US policy in Syria doesn't have a real end goal other than giving Russia and Iran a victory, I propose a new roadmap, a third way, in which its own regional stability and security.
Yeah, so as I told in the beginning, your roadmap, your report have gained huge attention in American and Turkish public opinion. So it seems like a real solution for this conflict, and also recovering the Turkish-American cooperation in international fields. So can you explain us your roadmap?
Okay, about my roadmap, first of all, I have to underline what kind of criteria led my vision to establish this roadmap. So the first criteria was that I wanted to build a vision that is built on the establishment of already present regional relations. So for instance, the existing partnership between Turkey and the Kurdistan region of Iraq has been a major milestone and major basis for my roadmap. I wanted to expand these already present relationships, and which are also supported by the US and also in interest of the US. The second criteria I had is that any roadmap in Syria should also address Israeli security concerns. I think the Iranian presence in Syria is of huge concern for Israel, as we have seen that the Israeli Air Force has been conducting many air attacks against Iranian military targets inside Syria. But unfortunately, none of these airstrikes are capable of blocking or cutting the Iranian land route, which goes from Tehran to Baghdad and to Damascus, and from there to Beirut, to Lebanon. And as you can see, the area where the American zone of influence ends, the Iranian zone of influence begins. And there is the border crossing of Abu Kamal, which is being used by Iran to supply its military presence in Syria and in Lebanon. The third criteria is that I did not want not want to establish a roadmap which would endanger a revival of ISIS. So we would need to have a roadmap which would even further strengthen the fight against ISIS and would encourage the counterterrorism efforts done over the recent years, and also weaken the Assad regime and help to establish a new political solution. So for this political solution, in line with 2254, my belief is that once the US and Turkey works together in Syria and change the realities and on the ground, the Assad regime will be forced its hand to accept a political transition. Last but not least, we have to address one of the realities as well. Should on the low local governance not encourage a minority local governance over majority, or majority local governance over minority. And we need to also secure the gains of the Syrian Kurds, and this roadmap should not ultimately result in Arabs occupying or dominating Syrian Kurdish areas on the local governance level. So therefore, I came up with a 6-step roadmap. And if you allow me, let's switch to the next map, the second map, and I will begin to explain my roadmap. So as I said to you in the beginning, we have the map on the local level. And my first step is to focus on the governorate of Deir ez-Zor. The governorate of Deir ez-Zor is the green block on the east of Syria. At the moment, this area should also be colored yellow. But after my first step, this area has to be colored with green. Why? I argue that the area of Deir ez-Zor, and I know this area quite well, is completely dominated by Sunni Arab tribes. This area is 100% Sunni Arab tribes. There aren't any Syrian Kurdish or any other minority groups present in the province of Deir ez-Zor. And Deir ez-Zor has the biggest oil resources of Syria. And we have in the Syrian Democratic Forces, the partner forces of the US, an entity which is responsible for the province of Deir ez-Zor, the the Deir ez-Zor Military Council. So I know it's complicated with all of these names, but it's important to explain that. The Deir ez-Zor Military Council is an important component of the Syrian Democratic Forces. And at the moment, they are dominated by the YPG, but they are made of the people from Deir ez-Zor. So what I argue is that the US and Turkey have to work together and end the penetration of the YPG, the Syrian Kurdish Marxists, who most of the times aren't even Syrian nationalists, citizens, but they are citizens from Turkey or Iran or Iraq, as they come from the PKK's Kandil cadres. We need to clean these areas from the YPG. And to ensure that this can be established, we have an opportunity. The local partner of the Turks and the moderate Syrian opposition, the Syrian National Army, has several thousands of fighters from Deir ez-Zor. And we have a population of from the northwest, 50,000. And we can work at these fighters and families. Deir ez-Zor military democracy with military units of the Syrian National Army. So the American-based and the Turkish-based Deir ez-Zor fighters, soldiers, will be united, and they will form the 8th Legion. So the 8th Legion will hiss the flag of the Syrian Revolution, and they will be part of the Syrian National Army. And by doing this, we can also encourage and strengthen the fight against ISIS, because we know that at the moment, the YPG is incapable of conducting successful counterterrorism operations against ISIS, because these people don't know the terrain, don't know the demographics, don't know the geography of Deir ez-Zor. But the people of Deir ez-Zor, they know their hometowns, they know their home societies, and they can work efficiently. To illustrate how insufficient the YPG is currently against ISIS, we know that the YPG has arrested and even to some extent tortured people accusing of being ISIS members, while these people were funded by the US State Department for NGO activities, because the YPG isn't capable of understanding who is an ISIS member and who isn't. These people are alien to the region of Deir ez-Zor, just like any other people. And this alien relationship of the locals to the YPG is also facilitating and encouraging the revival of ISIS, as we know from the experience in Iraq, where the Shia Iraqi government administration of Maliki oppressed the Sunni Arabs in Iraq to that extent that they supported ISIS in the early phases. And we do not want to happen in a similar scenario to be happen in the province of Deir ez-Zor. So therefore, the people of Deir ez-Zor, the pro-Turkish and the pro-American, should control their own regions with American and Turkish support, without the indoctrination and the domination of the YPG. And once this military structure has been established, we need the local people to elect their own local councils. And the Turkish armed forces, the Turkish special forces, should also be located to Deir ez-Zor to oversee over this process and to ease the burden on the Americans. And it's also possible to establish a Turkish helicopter and drone base for logistics, and also for the sixth step, which will I later elaborate on. So this was the first step. The first step is to limit the YPG and new armed to the next map.
Yeah, the next map.
So the next map would address the northern parts of the American zone of influence. So the southern part wasn't Deir ez-Zor. We have cleaned this area. Then we go to northern parts. The northern parts, the Hasaka province and the American zone of influence, are quite different. They are heterogeneous in terms of demographics. We have Syrian Kurds, we have Syrian Arabs, and we have also a very small Christian minority in this region. And the area you can see, which are colored in blue, are majority Kurdish populated areas, and the areas colored in green, gray, are majority Arab areas. So what I suggest is that the Syrian Kurds, which the Americans are at the moment supporting, are linked and affiliated to the PKK terrorist organization, therefore a no-go for Turkey, and an ultimately worse situation. What I argue is that the Americans cannot and should not abandon the Syrian Kurds, but rather change the Syrian Kurds who are in power over the Syrian Kurds. And these Syrian Kurds should be acceptable to Turkey and to the US as well. And they should be enjoyed and appreciated by the Syrian Kurdish population. So when I first say this, most of the people are shocked, from where should these Syrian Kurds come? But actually, they are already present. We know that the Syrian Kurdish National Coalition, which are Syrian Kurdish political parties that are close to the ruling party in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, the KDP, they have major support among the Syrian Kurds. Most of the Syrian Kurds actually support the Syrian Kurdish National Coalition. And the Syrian Kurdish National Coalition is so much more supported than the YPG that even very important and famous supporters of the YPG / the PKK have to admit in their books, like Vladimir von Wildenburg, that most of the Syrian Kurds support the Syrian Kurdish National Coalition. And the Syrian Kurdish National Coalition was actually, in the very beginning of the Syrian Revolution, very active. But later on, the YPG killed their leaders, arrested some of their leaders, exiled their leaders, attacked their political office, and most of them had to flee to the Kurdistan region of Iraq or to Turkey. So at the moment, the Syrian Kurdish National Coalition has an office in Istanbul, an office in Erbil, and they have a underground or semi-official presence there, which are sporadically attacked by the YPG. And interestingly, the Syrian Kurdish National Coalition has also an armored wing. And this armored wing is named the Rojava Peshmerga. At the moment, the Rojava Peshmerga are located in northern Iraq. They are trained by the Peshmerga forces of Iraq, of the Kurdistan region of Iraq. The Rojava Peshmerga have a very animous relationship with the PKK. The Kurdistan region of Iraq has majorly used the Rojava Peshmerga against the PKK's presence in Iraq. And we know that the Rojava Peshmerga has a huge, several thousands of military capacity. They have the training, they have the equipment, and they have the weapons. So what I suggest is that the Turkish, the American, and the Iraqi Kurdish governments should coordinate and cooperate their efforts in encouraging the takeover of Syrian Kurdish areas from the YPG and to be held by the Rojava Peshmerga. If this is being done, then Turkey will perceive this Rojava Peshmerga as friendly, open the border gates, economical activities will flourish. And in the Arab areas of Haseke, we have to repeat the model of their result, in which the local units of the Syrian Democratic Forces have to emancipate from the YPG and supported by the Haseke units of the pro-Turkish Syrian National Army. So once we have established this, we would have in the very north to the Turkish border, the Rojava Peshmerga, which will be named the 10th Legion of the Syrian National Army. In the south of Haseke, we would have the 9th Legion, composing of local Sunnis, and the 8th Legion in Deir ez-Zor, composing of local Sunni Arab tribal figures. And with this new local coordination on the ground, we would have end the main rift between the Americans and Turkey, which is the YPG, and we would enable local people to govern themselves locally while encouraging local councils to be elected by the local people. So if this is all clear up until here, I would like to go to the next step.
Yeah. By the way, the Rojava Peshmerga first actually entered to Syria during the siege of Ain al-Arab, as far as I remember. And the YPG administration have actually rejected their help against ISIS. So from the beginning, YPG is suppressing the Kurdish opposition and trying to block any other Kurdish actors to be helpful to the region, to the population.
Yes, but actually the YPG in 2014, when Ain al-Arab Kobane was on the verge of falling against ISIS, rejected the Peshmerga deployed to the Peshmerga. And we have for several units are not an executed, but the issue is dominated by the YPG. The decision making is controlled entirely by the YPGs, who we have to change this. So once we establish the two first steps, the map will look much differently. The areas colored in green would increase massively, but we will have two pockets of demographically Syrian Kurdish territories, which which are still under the Russian zone of influence and therefore controlled by the military presence of the Assad regime. So here, therefore, I propose in a third step that Turkey and the United States of America have to negotiate with Russia, that Russia has to withdraw from the rest of the Syrian Kurdish areas, and Turkey and the United States would encourage the Rojava Peshmerga to control these Syrian Kurdish areas. Which are they? They are the western side of Kamishli and the entirety of Ain al-Arab Kobane. If this can be established, then all of the Syrian Kurdish areas would be held and controlled by the Rojava Peshmerga, and the territories of the Syrian opposition, as the Rojava Peshmerga is also part of the Syrian opposition, by the way, would reach and would have territorial connectivity from the very south of the resort up until to the west of Idlib. But here, we have to anticipate that it's possible that Russia might make maximalist demands and might not accept to withdraw from these Syrian Kurdish areas and not open the way for Turkey and the United States of America and the Rojava Peshmerga. So therefore, I argue that the areas which are already under the Russian zone of influence and demographically Sunni Arab should be not hindered by, prevented by Turkey and the US to be controlled by the Assad regime in exchange for a Russian withdrawal from the Syrian Kurdish areas. If the Russians continue to make a maximalist demand, then the Turks and the Americans have two options. The first option would be to enforce their demands militarily, as they are capable of, because Turkish geography and the Turkish territorial connectivity to the Syrian Kurdish areas, they are next to the border of Turkey. makes it very hard for Russia to hold its ground. And the Russians would have to withdraw without a fight, as the military balance of power is on the side of Turkey and the US. And this would also which came under the regime. And wisely the Russians might say, we don't want to create a new chaos with the Russians. We want to play it cool and down and accept that these two Syrian Kurdish areas are in the Russian zone of influence. So here comes the question, what will happen to the YPG elements? They are being kicked out of Deir ez-Zor, out of Haseke, and out of the Syrian Kurdish areas, most likely. Here they have actually three options. The first option is that the YPG militants, especially those who did not join out of ideological motivation or can join the Rojava Peshmerga and can be integrated into the Syrian Kurds of the Rojava Peshmerga. The second option is that they can seek a new presence in the areas under the Russian zone of influence controlled by the Assad regime. And here Russia would have two options. Either they would maintain the YPG's control and indirectly expand the regime's territorial control, or they can impose a full regime territorial control and subordinate the YPG into the Assad regime. And the third option is that these YPG elements would also very likely go to northern Iraq and to the Kandil Mountains and engage with the PKK as they have been doing in the past. So this is the third step. If we can switch to the next map, I would like to elaborate on the fourth step. Okay, so the fourth step is a little bit, no, this is the other map. Oh, sorry, this map, exactly. So once we got rid of the YPG, one extreme and one terrorist-affiliated organization, there's another, the Hayat al-Hisham in Idlib. The Hayat al-Hisham is a radical terrorist organization which is designated as such by the United Nations, Turkey, NATO, and the US. And even though Hayat al-Hisham has cut its ties to Al-Qaeda, and they try to give an image of pragmatic presence in Idlib, they are a no-go for Turkey and the US, and therefore Turkey and the US have to clean Idlib from Hayat al-Hisham in the next step as well. And to achieve this, what can Turkey and the US do? I argue that they can encourage Hayat al-Hisham to disband itself and for its fighters to subordinate themselves, just like the YPG into the Rojava Peshmerga, into the Syrian National Army's presence in Idlib. In Idlib, the Syrian National Army operates for liberation. The 4th, 5th, 6th, and Legion of the National Army them inside the Syrian opposition structures. But you would have some dogmatics who would reject this. And against them, Turkey and the US can conduct a joint intelligence operation and take out these figures and can support the Syrian opposition militarily, financially, logistically to fight off these dogmatics in Idlib and to clean Idlib from any radical presence. So once this has been achieved, then the next step, the fifth step, is actually to come up with a supreme political body that can coordinate all of these areas. And even though we have a local governance in all areas, local councils elected by local people, we need also supreme, which coordinates all of these different military structures and these different local councils. And here I argue that the Syrian interim government, currently established by the Syrian opposition, has to be restructured. At the moment, the Syrian interim government is being elected by the Syrian National Coalition, which is accepted by 114 states, among others, Turkey and the US, as the representative of the Syrian people. But I argue that once we have established this new situation in Syria, that all of these local councils should send delegates into a bi-chamber parliament and make up one of the chambers. And these local council delegates should elect the Syrian interim government together with the Syrian National Coalition. So some people might ask why we have a bi-chamber election process. Why is the Syrian National Council still involved, and why do we not only let the delegates of local councils, which were elected by local people, decide on the Syrian interim government? The issue is, if the local councils alone and the delegates will decide on the supreme political body, its name will not be the Syrian interim government, but the government of northern Syria. So with this roadmap, we also want to avoid partitioning Syria and dividing Syria into two in the government of northern Syria and the Assad regime. Therefore, the Syrian National Coalition represents all of Syria, including the Syrian refugees and Syrians from Damascus and the south and the west of Damascus, Syria and central of Syria. So therefore, the Syrian National Coalition and the local council delegates should together elect the Syrian interim government, which should have an approach for all of Syria. And once we have the Syrian interim government, then we can negotiate a political settlement regime, and we would have a Syrian opposition and Assad UN resolution to negotiate a solution, political solution for Syria. Because at the moment on the ground, in reality, you have three axes: the Syrian opposition, the Assad regime, and the YPG dominate Syrian democratic forces. But the UN resolution foresees only two sides: the Syrian opposition and the Assad regime. So with this roadmap, we would transform this three-axis conflict into a two-axis conflict and enable a political solution to occur. So after establishing the Syrian restructuring the Syrian interim government, then we also need to address the Israeli security concerns and also to address the Iranian threat towards Turkey, the US, to the territorial integrity and safety and stability of Syria as well. And for that, the next map, please. I suppose that the Iranian land route, which goes to Abu Kamal, has to be taken over via a military operation. As I said in the first step, the Turkish armed force will establish a helicopter and drone base in the province of Deir ez-Zor. And the region of Abu Kamal is very far away from the Russian military airfields in the coast of Syria. So it is on the opposite side of Syria. And the Russian air defense, as the S-400 system, cannot cover the eastern part of Syria. So therefore, a military operation in this area is militarily feasible. However, at the moment, the US cannot cut this land route due to the relationship between the YPG/the PKK and Iran. But once we get rid of the YPG and establish the 8th Legion, which composed of Sunni tribal Arabs from Deir ez-Zor, we can do this because the Sunni tribal Arabs from Deir ez-Zor, they hate the YPG. They hate the YPG more than almost more than Netanyahu himself. So therefore, the 8th Legion, supported by the US and Turkey, can easily capture their homeland, Abu Kamal, and cut the Iranian land route from Iraq to Syria and reduce the Iranian supply line from Tehran to Damascus only to the air route via airplanes. And this would majorly ease the security tension and security risk for Israel and for Turkey and also for the regional states. And I think the Gulf states, the Arab states would also very much like this Iranian land route to be cut off. And we would have established a new environment in which the US and Turkey work together, but also security with Israel of the Syrians and the Arab funds and investments to Syria for rehabilitation, for restructuring, and for rebuilding of Syria after 12 years of destruction and war. So in general, this is my roadmap. I hope it was very clear and everything was understood. But if you have questions, I'm very happy to hear them.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Özkızılcık. I have a question with encouraging other participants to ask more questions. How does U.S. internal politics affect the application of this roadmap? I mean, U.S. foreign policy is much dependent on the presidential elections and the U.S. government. So Trump was pursuing some other Middle Eastern policy, and the Democrats are pursuing other policy than Trump. So who is more, whose more tendencies are like to apply this roadmap?
So first of all, we have to understand that at the moment, Syria is not high on the agenda in the US. For a long period, the US has not formulated a policy for Syria. The US current approach is the highest they have been doing is sanctions and sanctioning the Assad regime, the Qatar sanctions. But these are not policy goals. And the internal politics in the US, unfortunately, have this misconstruction that the ones who could change the US policy in Syria are not that much interested in Syria. And the ones who are in charge of Syrian affairs do have a different perspective and a different vision for Syria. At the moment, we know that CENTCOM is the main policymaker of the US in Syria. And usually, it should be the military personnel who implement policies and not craft policies. But unfortunately, due to lack of interest, we see that the military personnel are crafting policies for Syria. And CENTCOM has perceived its partnership with the YPG as a very successful model, as it is their own. They have invested for a very long term on the YPG, and they have established personal, emotional bonds with the YPG, and have put their bet on the YPG. And the mastermind, Brett McGurk, who is now the National Security Coordinator for Middle East and Northern Africa in the Biden administration and National Security Council, the man behind the YPG. We do not need policymakers establish in Syria that continue on its path and see this of military partnership and military joint experience on the front lines against ISIS. And this policy will in the end result in an Afghanistan similar disaster in which Iran and Russia takes over everything. So we need CENTCOM to wake up, and I have heard that some people in CENTCOM are thinking about the end game already. They have begun to think about this, but it's not enough. But we need decision makers in Washington, NATO allies, to think about Syria, especially at the time in which Russia has shown its real face in Ukraine. And we know that the Russian aggressions in Ukraine and second invasion would not have been possible if Russia was prevented in Syria. And the lack of action in Syria has facilitated the current situation in Ukraine, unfortunately. And I think to counter Russia, a strategy needs to include Ukraine. And if we can establish this roadmap, then the main source of friction between the US and Turkey would abolish, and the new alliance mentality and feeling and environment would come up in which the US and Turkey would work closely with each other. And this would enhance and strengthen the NATO alliance very much. Turkey's strategic role in the Black Sea is very important in this period. We have seen recently with the destruction of the US drone, how important the Turkish position in the Black Sea is. And not only that, Turkey's geographical position is the only country which links East and West to each other that isn't Russia. So if you want to go from the east to the west in this continent, from Asia to Europe, you have to go either to Russia or to Turkey. And Turkey is the only alternative here, and Turkey is a NATO ally. Once we establish this roadmap, this would facilitate the NATO alliance strength very much. But unfortunately, US domestic politics, the US lack of interest on Syria, and many people in Washington DC are fed up with Syria at all, are ignoring this. But I predict if this attitude doesn't change, we will see an Afghanistan-like scenario in which Russia and Iran takes over.
Yeah. So is there any other question from the participants? I think no. Okay. So that shows it was very fruitful and explanation on Syria. There is no question.
Thanks.
So thank you for sparing time, Mr. Özkızılcık. I hope to meet you in other webinars. Thank you for our participants for listening our webinar. Hope to see you again in the following sessions. Thank you.
Thanks. It was an honor for me. Looking forward to the next webinar.
Yeah, thank you.